Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll get started. So I want to say a quick thank you to everybody to joining. Welcome to the Environmental Justice in Minnesota. This is part of our Earth Fest celebration this year, and we're excited to have you here with us virtually. Our Earth Fest steering committee and partners have put together a full line of virtual events on all topics Earth related. And we invite you to visit our brand new website at earthfestrochestermn.org and follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/earthfestrochestermn to sign up for upcoming events. Today's event has been made possible by our sponsors that you've been seeing on our pre-event slideshow, including our platinum sponsors, Fresh Energy and Mayo Clinic, our gold sponsors, AARP, Conservation Minnesota, Destination Medical Center, Daguna Consulting, Minnesota Public Radio, Sierra Club North Star Chapter, and Solar Connection. And our silver sponsors, Christ United Methodist Church, HGA, People's Food Co-op, Rochester Area Foundation, XRG Concepts, and Zumbro Valley Audubon. If you have any technical issues tonight as we move through the presentation, please contact me, Amanda Holloway, in the chat or via cell phone. I added my number in the chat so you can reach out to me. Please keep your microphones muted unless invited to ask questions. And you can also submit questions in the chat, which we will be monitoring throughout the event. You may turn your video on or off as you prefer. This session is being recorded and you'll be sent a link of the recording in the next few days. So now I'm excited to get us started with today's topic. I'm going to turn it over to our session moderator, Lauren Jensen, to kick things off. So Lauren, over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. And thank you to everyone who is joining us tonight. I am Lauren, the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Rochester. And we're really excited to have some presenters here tonight with us from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Environmental Justice Group. As our sustainability department really works out to build what it means to be truly sustainable in our community, we're focusing not only on the environmental aspects, but the economic and most importantly, the social equity aspects that go into sustainability here as well. I encourage all of you to think of questions throughout the presentation. We will have some time, as Amanda mentioned, at the end for questions and discussion. And we are very excited to kick this off. So with further ado, I will hand it over to Ned Brooks, the Environmental Justice Coordinator at the MPCA, and José Luis Villaseñor, the Environmental Justice Outreach Coordinator at the MPCA. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And Lauren, should I do the slides? Is that best?
If you'd, I'm happy to pull them up if that's easier for you. Whatever works.
I'll do it right now.
Okay.
Can you see the slides?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Okay, well, thanks everybody. It's really an honor to be here with you. This is the only Earth Day event that I'm participating in for work this year, which I usually try to do so at least one event every year. So thanks for putting some together virtually. Really appreciate that. Let's see. I'll introduce myself. I'm Ned Brooks. I'm the Environmental Justice Coordinator. As Lauren mentioned, I've worked at the Pollution Control Agency for quite a number of years. I worked with the Olmsted County Public Works really early on in my career to establish the Household Hazardous Waste Collection Program in Rochester, site at the facility there, I think, and I'm assuming that still is in place, but that's something I worked on in that part of the state. I've worked on a whole variety of programs at the Pollution Control Agency, but for the last 8 years or so, I have been working on environmental justice. Turn it over to José Luis.
Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you so much for having us today. My name is José Luis Villaseñor, and I'm the Environmental Justice Outreach Coordinator. And I'm really grateful to be invited to be involved in this necessary conversation right now around environmental justice, social justice and equity and diversity that hopefully will walk you through and not bore you. And just thank everyone for taking time out of their day and away from their families and things you love to do to be with us here today.
Yeah, sorry, I just realized my screen was off if you were seeing a blank box of me. Anyway, I will give you a little overview of the Pollution Control Agency, talk about environmental justice, what that means, look at some of the disparities in Minnesota with respect to exposure to pollution, and talk about some of the things we're working on.
Yeah, and just we would like to emphasize that we really want to have a dialogue with all the participants today and staff and everyone that's joining us today. So we're gonna go through this, but feel free to throw in some questions in the chat. The Pollution Control Agency mission is to improve the environment and human health. As you can see here with our definition, our mission and our vision is to serve and support a healthy people, ecosystem, and a thriving economy. This is really important. This is really an important aspect that really pushes us to embrace environmental justice policies and direction that we'll talk about here today with you.
And we also wanted to give a little bit of a background about the Pollution Control Agency and what we do. We work with state and other state agencies and local governments, as I mentioned, like Olmsted County, to try to pursue the mission that José Luis just went over. And we do this in kind of four major ways. We measure pollution in the environment, in the air, in the water, and in the land. And when we find that there's too much pollution, our job is to clean it up, whether that be the land or the water or the air. And we do that by regulating sources of pollution. You may be surprised to know that a lot of pollution, it used to be the majority of pollution was, factory and pipes and so forth, but because of decades and decades of efforts by companies to clean up their pollution and regulatory programs to work on that, some of the remaining hardest to tackle pollution, those are still significant sources, but some of the remaining ones are pollution that is created by a lot of us in our daily work, day-to-day lives, including vehicles and runoff from the land. That includes from our yards, but also agricultural runoff, small businesses, et cetera. So a lot of these we don't specifically regulate like we do the large industries. So we have to work through education and outreach to try to compel those reductions.
And so as an agency, we're a very data-driven agency, and we kind of work on the point sources of fine particulates that affect either our water, our air that we breathe. We regulate some of these industries, but we know where all the sources of pollution are coming from, and we're highly aware of them, and try to, like Ned was saying, encourage residents either to reduce some of their pollution through grants, through encouraging businesses, individuals, companies, maybe to switch over from, gas run equipment at the landscaping business to electric, or to reduce some of the solvents they're using at their body shop and or chemicals at the local laundromat, dry cleaner business. And so we know where they're coming from. We're finding ways, crafty ways to educate, like Ned said, but also financially encourage folks to switch away. Next slide. So with that knowledge, our definition of environmental justice, as we have recently redefined, has been the right for communities of color, indigenous communities, and low-income communities to enjoy healthy environments. and fair treatment and respect around development, adaptation, implementation, enforcement, and environmental laws and regulation and policies, environmental policies as well. So this is our new updated environmental justice definition that we have and landed on as an agency. So the magic or the effort of environmental justice gives us an opportunity to use the data, but to figure out also what are the layers of environmental impacts that overburdened communities are experiencing, from police brutality, mass incarceration, unemployment, the broken immigration system, lead-filled homes, food deserts, are other layers that environmental justice asks us to do. Environmental justice asks us to say, yes, if we're talking about air, land, or water, what are the other social impacts that are happening that overburdened communities don't have the luxury to remove from? So as we're talking about overburdened communities, through the data of our point sources of environmental impacts, environmental justice asks us to incorporate and to be aware of the other social toxins that community of color, indigenous communities, and overburdened communities are experiencing, whether in Rochester, in South Minneapolis, or in Duluth. There's a need for environmental justice. Environmental justice pushes us to make sure that we're combining these other layers as well. As you can see here, at a national view, environmental racism is nothing new for low-income communities of color, of being exposed to other air pollutants, or at times not having access to clean potable water, or at times live closer to a toxic waste site. So the dynamic or the concept of race and class, when you overlay it with the data we have and environmental justice, it shows us a different lens of how communities of color, low-income communities, are being overburdened by environmental degradation and impact. As we dive deeper into this data, this is now local data. It's been updated within the last year. But if you look at the air quality risk or air pollution based on the statewide, 32% of the population is exposed to air pollution. But when you incorporate low income, it's 46% they're exposed to air pollution. And then when you add people of color, indigenous community, and this is hard to say and to share, it's at 91% in the state of Minnesota. So in the midst of environmental justice and Earth Day, it's important now as environmentalists and as folks concerned about the communities to see the effects that environmental impacts are having on vulnerable communities of color and low-income communities.
Yeah, and then the slide, the part of that slide on the right talks about this. So the part on the left is areas of the state that are exposed to poor air quality, and part of that is living near a facility that we permit. When a large industrial source of pollution has to get a permit from us, and the permit is how we regulate that pollution. But 14% of the larger facilities are near communities of color, while 9% low income and only 6% statewide. So anyway, further demonstrating kind of that lower income people and people of color are exposed to more pollution. That's some of our local data. And there's literally hundreds of studies, published papers and studies that document how low-income communities and people of color are exposed disproportionately. So what we do in Minnesota is we define what we consider areas of concern for environmental justice. And we use demographic information as a first step in that by looking at census tracts that are majority people of color, or have more than 40% of the population living above the poverty threshold, or recognized tribal areas. So the map in the Minnesota map, you can see those areas throughout the state. The majority of areas that are considered areas of concern for environmental justice because of people of color are located in the Twin Cities, but there's pockets around the state. This is a view of Rochester, where you can see the areas that we consider to be areas of concern for environmental justice, meaning that they have higher number of lower income households.
And I
So
would,
interesting.
Sorry, Ned.
Please.
I would just add that this is a mapping tool that we use internally, and we have also access to, community members have access to these mapping tools as well externally. And these are just the methods or tools that we use to identify and to get to know at an outer level who's being exposed or what the makeup of a community in the area. Sorry, Ned, I just wanted to just share that a little bit of this. These are tools that we use.
I probably would have forgotten to say that this next slide is a screenshot of that online tool where we focused in on Rochester, and the tabs are different ways users can focus in on income or people of color, tribal area, language. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then we have a tab for air pollution. So interestingly, so for air pollution, we use our monitoring and our understanding of what's being emitted in an area to forecast health risks of air pollution. And so the darker the purple, the more the health risks. Interestingly, I'll just go back to this slide. It's not a direct overlay, but some of the areas with the poorer air quality are actually the lower income areas. So this is an example of what we would consider to be environmental justice in the Rochester area, where the lower income communities, not all of them, are exposed to higher levels of air pollution. So that's not always by accident. And you may have heard of the concept of redlining, which is one discriminatory housing practice that was started in the 30s, where the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation rated neighborhoods in terms of their riskiness for mortgage lenders. And those risk factors, in some cases, were based on race and proximity to industrial areas, et cetera. So it's an early example of how government policies have concentrated low-income people and people of color in more polluted areas. And this is a picture of the map, the redlining map from Rochester in the 30s or 40s, and the red areas were deemed to be hazardous to as a mortgage investment perspective, and the yellows were determined to be declining neighborhoods. So again, if you go and compare the air quality to these neighborhoods, it's just really interesting how there is some connection there. Here's a better map of those areas, kind of using modern day images. So that's pretty striking. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, I think, something just to emphasize is you're seeing some of the data, you're seeing how the MPCA uses our data to understand where the point source is. We also understand the impacts, what vulnerable communities are experiencing outside of the environmental impact. And now Ned, and through the lens of environmental justice, it pushes us to really say environmental racism or environmental impacts on vulnerable communities is not something created in a vacuum. It's actually something that was strategically planned, was strategically aware of policies that were strategically disinvesting in communities of color and making sure these were places that that weren't seeing any support or were being neglected. And so it's environmental justice tells us to say, this is not something in a vacuum. There's a system at play that creates some of this environmental impacts that we are experiencing now that have been correlated with some of the redlining and racial covenants that some cities and cities experience. And so as a continuum into the environmental justice, pushing us to view through a different lens, it also gives us some pillars of where we should land around environmental justice as a regulatory agency, and that's fair treatment and meaningful involvement.
So we'll talk a little bit more about fair treatment and meaningful involvement as the pillars of environmental justice. And fair treatment really means that everyone should benefit from our work and a clean, healthy, natural environment, and that pollution doesn't harm one group more than another. And we just in the previous slides we've shown that certain groups of people are exposed to more pollution, particular by race and income, than others, and that's you would consider that to be environmental justice. And so fair treatment means we're striving to make sure that everyone has a healthy environment to live in, but even more so that those who are the most vulnerable, and oftentimes lower income people and people of color, are more vulnerable to the impacts of pollution. And we're seeing that with COVID, for example, that COVID is having a higher impact on people of color in particular. So not everybody responds to stressors in the environment in the same way. And so therefore we want to make sure we're not just treating everybody equally so that we're all exposed to the same levels of pollution, but even beyond that to make sure we're doing what we can to protect those most at risk.
And again, in environmental justice, through meaningful involvement, asks us the question, who is missing at the table? Who is missing in the conversation and discussions around the effects of environmental and in health concerns? And we seek out, as the MPCA, through the environmental justice lens, to involve community members as frequent and often as soon as we can when there is an environmental concern and or changes in their communities. The way that the MPCA has also landed on meaningful involvement through environmental justice is making sure that community members, like I mentioned earlier, are part of the conversation, but part of the process, and influences the outcomes if and when possible during any environmental concern and issue in the community that has been brought to our attention and or that we are working on within an environmental justice overburdened community.
We've been working on environmental justice more concertedly in the past 6 to 8 years. This is sort of some of the bureaucratic stuff that we won't go into too much, but it's it's been a focus of our strategic plan, which hasn't been the case always. We have 3 full-time people working on environmental justice, which it used to be more like a quarter of somebody's time. And we also have an environmental justice advisory group that we're working with. And my job is to work with all of our 20 programs to make sure we're integrating the principles of environmental justice into their work, meaning understanding how the air permitting program, for example, can focus its work on areas of concern for environmental justice to reduce air pollution in those areas and make sure people are meaningfully involved. At
my end, in cahoots with Ned's work, is making sure that we're centering those directly affected by environmental degradation and environmental impact. And our advisory group is a group that allows us to bring in a set of community members in and outside vulnerable communities and environmental justice movements and out to be in concert with our commissioners. So we've been running an advisory group at the state regulatory agency at the MPCA for the last 3 years. And so this is an opportunity and an example on how we're trying to work closely with communities that are directly affected by a lot of the data and statistics that you just saw of the impact, environmental impacts that communities of color and low-income communities are experiencing throughout our state. And so this is an opportunity for those that are on the advisory group to bring their voices, their networks and perspectives on how we are landing around authentic engagement around environmental justice and how we're implementing environmental justice within all of our work and programs.
And I think that's it. So we were successful in leaving plenty of time for discussion.
Thank you both very much. I guess we don't have any questions in the chat, but if we'll just kind of give it a minute here if there's anyone in attendance that has any questions or points of discussion that they'd like to bring up for the group. We do have one question in the chat here now. I'll just go ahead and read it out loud. How do you weigh impacts when alternatives are just moving a problem into another disadvantaged community? An example given is lots of concerns about HERC, the waste to energy facility in Minneapolis, but landfills are often located in marginalized areas.
Yeah, well, hopefully we're not just moving problems around. Hopefully we're making everything, making it better for everybody. But pollution is a byproduct of people living their daily lives. So to a certain extent, we're always going to have pollution in our lives. And what we try to do is make sure that's not inequitably distributed, let's say. So that's definitely a concern. Part of the problem we face is that major pollution sources, including things like incinerators, like the HERC is a waste to energy facility in Minneapolis, and factories and highways and so forth, they exist, they're hard to move. And they've, for a whole variety of reasons, some of the policies like redlining that we mentioned, but also settlement patterns, have led to the development of our cities and areas the way they are. And it's hard to change those. So when we are considering new facilities or changes to existing facilities, that's a real key time to consider the impacts that it's posing to a community and how we can mitigate those. So that's a good question. We don't want to just move it around. We want to try to make it better. José Luis, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think if anything, making better as much as we can to educate our communities on products that we use, products that we consume, things that we can, ways that we can compost or find ways to reduce our impact before our waste ends up in a landfill and or into a incinerator. And I know it's hard to take or to understand or take from an agency like us, but I think it's really important that we're also incorporating education and learning opportunities, just as we're working with businesses to teach them about environmental justice, but also ways to reduce their environmental impacts.
We have a couple more questions in the chat here now. Can you share some projects or programs that you consider as success stories for addressing environmental justice?
Well, knowing that environmental justice at our agency and within a lot of organizations, we know that it's a very long game. It's a long process due to our regulatory responsibilities that are issued to us by legislators that we all, as residents of Minnesota, vote into power that tell us our directive and our rules of how we're supposed to operate. I feel for me, a lot of the work has been to be in concert with overburdened environmental justice communities, whether on the north side or the west side of St. Paul or other communities that typically are not at the table in regards to facilities they're concerned about. I think those have been overseen positive stories that I don't think hit the media as often, but that we're a part of and being in concert with community members on centering their perspectives of what they're experiencing environmentally, while other concerns that they share with us at the same time. Are there some examples, Ned, that you could think of besides?
Yeah, I think a great example is how we have been able to incorporate environmental justice into our grants. And one big one that people might have heard about is that Volkswagen was caught cheating on their emissions control equipment on their vehicles and had to pay a huge fine to the federal government, and states received a portion of that based on the percentage of maybe it was percentage of Volkswagen vehicles sold in the state or something, but Minnesota received $57 million to reduce diesel air pollution. And we worked with the people developing that grant program and our advisory group to devise a way to give priority to some of that, a big part of that funding for reducing air pollution in lower income neighborhoods. So that's not a success story of closing down a facility or something like that, which people often think of, but it was a way that we were able to take the principles of environmental justice and really apply it to our program work to be able to hopefully address pollution in those areas. I would say another example, and there's a lot of examples where we have, and José Luis alluded to this, and it's a long game, but had more of a community focus when we're doing our work, whether that's through permitting or inspections or something like that, but really making sure we're involving the community in that. And oftentimes a facility will voluntarily try to make things reduce their impacts to address community concerns. So also connecting the community and the facilities more, so that there's more of a collaboration in that regard too.
I think really quick, if you don't mind here, in the aspect of success, I think behind the curtains as an agency, we recently have been really diving into providing anti-racist training to our staff at the agency and incorporating more equity and diversity and inclusion within our work, understanding that for our staff to really grasp and embrace environmental justice, there is a need to understand how other communities are living, other indigenous communities, communities of color, vulnerable communities are experiencing their life experience in a state like Minnesota. And so behind the curtain, the agency for me in a success has dedicated the last 2 years in really putting efforts in making sure that our staff are highly trained and prepared to embrace all the different rich cultures of our state, while at the same time fulfilling our mission, protecting the environment and human health.
Our next question here is, what suggestions do you have for individuals to make an impact in their daily lives?
That's a good question. I think have hard conversations with your family members. A variety of topics that are going on in our communities and our country, and related to environment, finding out ways in supporting communities in your surrounding area. I think I like the thing about environmental justice. It doesn't tell us to focus on a campaign, but to be concerned about our neighbors, that maybe have issues in finding healthy local foods, or supporting organizations that are helping individuals to pay their mortgage or rent. That is an environmental justice, part of environmental justice as well. So don't allow people to silo you in just being an environmentalist, but to being a good neighbor and standing up for justice.
And does that answer, is that what you meant by your question, Julie, there about suggestions for individuals, if it's, reducing our own impact, or as Jose Luis was responding to, sort of making a kind of thinking about it more holistically, like environmental justice. But if it's about reducing your own impact, I would say look at energy consumption and try to reduce that, whether it be through transportation or electricity use or home heating or something like that. I think that's one of the bigger sources of a lot of different pollution, global warming and local air pollution and so forth.
And I know it's hard to say sometimes, but if you can reduce your transport or using a vehicle as much as you can, carpool, bike, if there's no bike infrastructure in community, organize a block and demand that you have more bike safe access and safer streets. Because I think one of the ways to reduce our impact on the environment is, if we can, drive less.
And there's an environmental justice component there too, and that's making sure, and this isn't something that we directly work on, but making sure that the infrastructure and amenities, whether that be parks or bike lanes or other benefits of sort of a green community, are available to everyone, or are equally present in lower income communities as regular as higher income communities.
Yeah, I think definitely being an advocate or an ally is important there. And just to piggyback off kind of that question and a little bit what you were touching on in the last question, I'm curious just about some of your engagement experiences. Recently, currently Rochester is working on a sustainability and resiliency action plan for our community. And we really sort of embarked on a different type of engagement process with that plan. To try to capture those voices that aren't typically represented throughout our community in processes like that. And one thing we found was that, we really asked people about their lived experiences, and we kept it pretty broad. But Rochester is a very diverse community, partially because of Mayo Clinic. And so when meeting with some of those diverse communities, especially older generations, they didn't always understand climate change or concepts surrounding the environment or really how it affected them. So I'm just wondering if you have an experience or thoughts on how you've gone about engaging with more diverse populations when it comes to some of these issues of environmental justice. And if there are any specifics towards we're fortunate to have some great leaders within those communities, but just really empowering other folks to kind of step up and participate and speak out on these things.
Yeah, I think it's always important to come with the agenda to listen and not be prepared to mine communities that may be new to the table, or that you've identified that they're missing and you've invited them in or to the conversation. And to also to be present in community that has no agenda tied to it, and that you're not out to receive anything, but you're just in community with community. And I think that sets up an opportunity of trust, relationship, and it gravitates to what Ned and I talk a lot about, is environmental justice is about creating relationships, especially with those that are not at the table and typically are not allowed to be at the table. And so I think what's really important in creating that trust and that relationship is always trying to be in community before there is a problem. And to remember that we're always in community, whether you're picking up your kids from school or you're waiting in line to buy groceries or to get coffee. Those are also opportunities to test out what it is to be a good neighbor to your neighbor. And those will develop the skills to be able to be in community to build trust. But yeah, I think it's important. And to also remember that conflict is not abuse, and to understand that people's passion, people's anger, let's say about a certain issue in the community, it's actually a love for themselves, their community, and their concerns for the safety of the community. So I think it's important to always listen actively, be there to listen, be in community as often as you can, and build relationships.
Okay, our next question in the chat here. People tend to see the proposed clean cars as an initiative that's just for people who can afford a Tesla. Can you talk about the environmental justice components?
Yeah, so the clean car rule has, José Luis and I have worked on it on the periphery. We're not the best ones to speak about it, but it has two parts. Trying to get more electric cars on the road is a big one. But another big one is also applying stricter pollution control requirements on all new vehicles sold in the state. And that's going to obviously, especially in the short term, have a bigger impact or affect more vehicles. But living, pollution from vehicles and living near a roadway is a huge environmental justice concern. And in one of the early slides, José Luis showed a figure there, but about 40%, what is it, 40%? Oh, people of color are exposed to 40% more of a certain pollution that's predominantly from vehicles than white Minnesotans. And that's primarily due to living near traffic sources. So this rule would have a major environmental justice benefit because of reducing pollution from all vehicles, well, new vehicles, and eventually those vehicles will dominate the percentage of vehicles on the road. So that's the big environmental justice win there. And yes, there will be, it's pushing more electric vehicles, but that's going to have a benefit for people who are not necessarily buying a new electric vehicle by reducing the pollution of the drivers driving by the lower income people. If you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, and just how you were, just what you ended there with, I just want to dive a little deeper in that. And our data shows in regards to environmental justice and impacts on vulnerable and indigenous communities of color and low-income communities, we understand that affluent white folks typically have more access to transportation, let's use as an example, and or let's say agriculture or certain foods. But yet, if you flip that over, that access means that communities of color experience more burden related to transportation and to ag. So if you look at any resource from ag to transportation and who has access to those things, and then who holds the grunt or the impact of that environmental impact is typically communities of color. So is clean car the number one only cool thing that's going to stop environmental racism? Probably not, but it's going to, again, make small impacts to reduce the environmental concerns that communities of colors are experiencing while living next to highways that that at times they don't have access to because they can't afford a car. They may not even be able to get on the bus because they can't afford it, based on historical unemployment and disinvestment in the communities. So I think we have to be really crafty in how we talk about and look at these opportunities to reduce impact, whether it's clean cars or how we permit facilities.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, we have a question in the chat. If this is somewhat counter to the idea of putting affordable housing in transit-oriented districts, which is generally on major traffic lines. Anything on that aspect?
You know, whoever's asking that question, I would make sure that you're centering those that are experiencing housing crises on where they want their homes to exist and where they want to get to and from that home. I think that's really important to do so that there's no need to backpedal when those houses are being developed. I think it's really important to center that question to those that are directly experiencing housing concerns or injustice.
And hopefully for us, we've, have a few electric buses on the way if those transit-oriented districts can be more electric-based than diesel.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's housing, gentrification, or reducing environmental impacts, if we're not centering those that are directly affected by these inequities or in negative impacts, then we're missing an opportunity to land at the right place now and not have to fix things later.
We have another question here. Can you share any unique partnerships or collaborations that the MPCA is engaged in to help address both environmental and social toxins?
Like I mentioned earlier, in the aspect of creating relationships and trust, we're making sure that we're connecting with people like within the Sierra Club, Copal, a Latinx organization in the Twin Cities and across the state, working on immigration reform and environmental justice policies. We're also making sure that we're connecting with our neighbor associations, our block leaders, our community connectors on what they're experiencing and seeing, so that we know that we are landing on the right concerns the communities are sharing with us. And so I think we're in partnership with a lot of folks. I think there's still more folks to be in partnership with that maybe we haven't identified yet. But those are just some. I think the advisory group gives us an opportunity to connect through them to their communities and organizations that work across the state or within a geographic area and a particular cultural community or diverse community. So our partnerships are very unique, but are very forward, and that's making sure that all residents are participating.
Any other final questions from everyone? We don't have anything else in the chat here. If not, I thank you both for your time tonight. It was a great presentation and certainly gets me excited about some of the initiatives we've started here. We recently installed air quality monitors throughout the city, and it will be interesting to compare those, especially with our areas of environmental justice concern here in the city. So I think there's good headway happening, and just even this presentation here tonight shows some areas for opportunity for our work here in the city and some things that we can be looking at as we progress on some of these projects. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending and participating with questions. Have a good rest of your evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Great questions. Appreciate it. Thank you.